Bonjour et bienvenue à la conférence de presse d'aujourd'hui. I'm Stephanie Levitz with the Toronto Star, and I'll be moderating. I'll invite our guests to make a few opening remarks, and then we'll turn the floor to questions. Go ahead, please.
Le ministre Marc Miller, Mr. Bourvatan. Donc, bonne outil de l'éducateur, des autres Bourvatan, tous les journalistes. Donc, les narcomatans et la rencontre qu'on avait eue, les gardiens du ministre Marc Miller, il traîne les traités Petapan, non? Les histoires avec le Québec, c'est comme l'Indien. Donc, là, on a pas 40 ans que.
It's been 40 years since we've started to negotiate with other communities, but we are 3 communities for the Petapan Treaty. I'm also here with Martin Dufour and Gilbert Dominique.
Des membres des 3 communautés pour avoir une entente.
We are looking to come to an agreement on the treaty.
Donc, depuis le 31 mars.
Since March 31st.
Avec les fédérales. On a fait on est bien content que.
We are quite happy that we've had an agreement on the treaty since March 31st with the federal government. It's very important for our people. Thank you very much. I'm going to let the others speak up. I'm going to repeat a little bit as what Chief Tetod said. We have been negotiating for 40 years. In 2004, we signed an agreement, and it's on the basis of that agreement that we've been negotiating. We had a deadline for March 31st. We're very happy to announce that we came to an agreement with the federal government on a treaty project, but Quebec is asking for more time. We wonder why. Today, we are with Minister Miller to call upon the Premier of Quebec. We would like to have a meeting. As you know, during the provincial campaign, it was said that we would have an agreement by March 31st, and we would like that promise to be kept by the Premier. We are asking for a formal meeting with him today. I will pass the mic to Chief Dominique.
Alors que nous avons voulu.
What we are seeking to do today is also confirm that we are underway. Our 3 First Nations will initiate a process of information and exchange with our members. Communication activities with external audiences. We are thinking of other First Nations, neighboring populations as well. They will also be communicated with in order to get support within Quebec civil society. Among other things, it is important to point out that the implementation of the treaty, particularly its financial and economic aspects, will contribute to a new era of prosperity and development, not only for the First Nations, but also for the members from other regions, from the North Shore and from the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean regions. We are talking about an injection of billions of dollars that will go directly into the economy of the concerned regions and of our bands, which will inevitably create an incredible leverage effect for us, for the concerned regions, and surely for Quebec. We therefore call upon the government of Quebec and its premier to behave honorably towards our First Nations and to finalize these negotiations in the coming weeks. Right now, we are aiming for a goal which would allow us to have government independence and self-sufficiency. Sadly, we are only missing the agreement with Quebec, and we are hoping for full collaboration in order to be able to finalize our treaty.
Kwekwe, hello et bonjour. D'abord, je vous remercie d'être ici.
Thank you for being here. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on unceded traditional Algonquin territory. I'd like to thank Chiefs Dufour, Dominique, and Tetou for being here today. What you feel today in this room is something that is being felt in these communities. It's optimism. People are optimistic that there might be a historic treaty, not just in Quebec, but in Canada. As the chiefs said, this is a treaty that would resolve many legal issues that are with very long histories and surpass the 4 decades of have happened perhaps too publicly. The government of Quebec and Premier Legault made reconciliation a personal responsibility and endeavor. For the Canadian and Quebec populations, they naturally expected that the deadline, which was ambitious and aggressive, of 31st of March would be respected. Canada was also expected to do its part, but we also expected Quebec to do its part. We've all worked very hard. Sadly, the opportunity to reach an agreement was not there on March 31st. So we have a situation that has presented itself, which has not been managed properly, which is a shame because a promise was made to the Quebec population, not only during the campaign, but also during the holiday season. We do, of course, still have hope that Quebec will join us. Minister Lafrenière assured me that there was still some work to be done. However, unlike other provinces, such as British Columbia, where this kind of process is institutionalized and where the personal is less important, it will necessitate the Premier's intervention.
Inuit chiefs from Quebec who have been working well over 40 years to sort out some really painful chapters of their history and, in fact, our shared history, and come to a modern treaty with Quebec and Canada, which had and does have the potential to be one of the most important, not only in Quebec, which would be a first since the Paix des Braves in the 70s, but a first really in its scope and financial contribution in Canada. The potential for economic impacts and reconciliation is enormous, not only for the populations that these 3 chiefs serve, but for the entire, because reconciliation deals with non-Indigenous populations as well, and mostly a potential to have real economic impacts in areas that deeply need it. Negotiations like this should never really be done in public. It has the potential for a politicization of it. It should never be that case. Prime Minister Legault, however, made this a very public commitment to the population that I serve in Quebec, to all of Canada during the electoral period, as well as during Christmas and during the New Year's, to get something done by March 31st. And we all worked hard to get there. And unfortunately, Quebec currently still has some issues to sort out. what you saw here in the last three presentations is a message of hope as well. There is a real potential for this to radiate across Canada as a real example of what a province can do when politicians are personally implicated in getting this done. And so I do think today is an opportunity to express disappointment, but also some hope that we can get to a place where we do not have Indigenous populations still subject to the Indian Act, but really are taking control of what is theirs and their inherent right to determine the future of their populations and the relationships that we entertain and have to respect with them as non-Indigenous people. So I'll conclude on those words. Again, aujourd'hui, je pense qu'il faut passer à...
I think we need to send a message of hope today. Quebec still has some work to do in order to arrive to a final destination, and we do harbor that hope. Today is also an opportunity to express our disappointment since Quebec is not budging despite the promises that were made during the campaign.
Merci. On a, je pense, 30 minutes.
Thank you. I think we have 30 minutes for questions. We will start with the journalists in the room. First, Shushan Bacon from APTN. Thank you for having invited us. I wanted to take the time to speak in Innu to my chiefs from the Innu nations. My question is for Minister Marc Miller. When we talk about a treaty, this, of course, relates to ancestral rights. All treaties that have been signed with First Nations touch upon ancestral rights. How important will ancestral rights be in the Petapan Treaty? Thank you for the question. It's very important. With all modern treaties, which should be respecting the rights of First Nations, according to the UN as well, the ancestral rights are, of course, very important. So we will be continuing with this negotiation publicly. I think that we should say very vocally that these treaties don't want to extinguish those rights, but want to amplify them, especially starting with the rights to self-determination, which is a fundamental right to any nation. The damages have been historical, they have been recorded, and they have had massive economic and socioeconomic impacts on these communities. It is also important to bring in elements in these treaty that can change over the time and highlights our relationships between peoples. I know that it is very rich for the chiefs. I don't want to speak on their behalf or for your people, but it is an opportunity to do things differently in the context of the Indian Act, which was imposed on you and was racist. May I ask a second question? The Huron Nation went to the Supreme Court concerning these lands, and the Petapan Treaty touches on the Huron-Wendat lands. What are the discussions that you're having with the Huron-Wendat nation?
I will not hide to you that there are some heated arguments with the Huron-Wendat nation. I will not talk in public about our negotiations and how we were able to deal with the issues, mostly in the southwest region, with the position of the federal government and the provincial government, which exacerbated those grievances. But please be assured that we will always have open and candid conversations with the Huron Nation. And today, Yes, it is a litigation that can sometimes be public, but out of respect for a party that is not present in the room, I will not say more about what's going on during the negotiations. Are there any other questions in the room? Hello, Mylène Crête from La Presse. I would like to know, where are things stuck with the Quebec government? I know you were talking about a 500 megawatt with the Quebec government, and you also work with companies, with wood companies. We don't have a barrier per se in that area because we're just waiting for their reaction and their proposal. You're talking about updating the system that had been agreed upon in 2004 when it comes to the economic aspect. We offered a scenario, but of course we realized that after 20 years of negotiation and after an agreement on principle, we wanted to update and find solutions to make sure that we still have a treaty that is balanced. We had that idea. So we are waiting for Quebec to come back to us on two components: the financial aspect that deals with compensation for past injustices, and also the other aspect is what we call the economic deal, which is proposals in terms of megawatt and forest, or other proposals, such as sending a clear message to agree with companies what we could have with the indigenous populations. There was resistance. There was an openness when it comes to resources, but some resistance when it comes to forest exploitation. So actually, there's not really anything blocking, but we're just waiting for them to come back to us and make an offer so we can have a conversation for what's coming next. So if I understand well, this silence is the fact that Quebec is just taking more time than expected. It's not the fact that they're not willing to agree. No, they're just waiting to understand. What they say is that they're trying to digest the content of the treaty, and we know that they're trying. There's a clear exercise of communication and information within the government. Even though we're 20 years later, does it mean that there are other issues that are being hidden and that we're not being told about? We're here right now because there's silence from the Quebec government, despite the last communications that we had with the Premier's office and from Minister Lafrenière. We interpret this as an uncertainty right now. Of course, for us, we need a strong message from the Premier to respect his commitment during his electoral campaign. And we hope to finalize things as we were able to do with the federal government. Jérôme from Espace Autochtone, what we're telling us is what we said a month ago. You're calling on the Quebec government to have a meeting, and they're not responding. There's no response. Have you not communicated with them since the 31st of March? We were able to talk to representatives of the Premier to talk about the situation. Unfortunately, we left that meeting disappointed because there were no indicators on what Quebec will offer and when they will do so. So today, we took the opportunity to meet Minister Miller to show and say, look, after 40 years of negotiation with the federal government, we came to an agreement, and this is the message of hope that we want to send to our populations, but also we would like to point out that Quebec still need to do their part in this deal in order to have an agreement with all the parties that are involved. This is what we wanted to announce today. It's good news. We managed to agree on a deal with the federal government. This is a major outcome, and this is what we wanted to show today. Also to answer this, and I would like to know that if provinces want, they can go much faster than us and much faster than the federal government. The main cash contribution comes from the federal government. And the machine at the federal level is slower. But when a province wants to act, they can do it. And this is what was imposed on us, and it came in a very public way. Of course, I am expressing some frustration. When people want to do something, it's possible to do things. And we are not feeling that willingness from Quebec when it comes to reconciliation. That is a very personal issue. Because the institutionalization of these issues are not taking place. And this is I'm just taking note. We did a lot of work to make sure to meet that deadline that was very ambitious. And it's blocking at the Quebec level.
Justement, ma deuxième question s'en venait.
My second question was directed to you and was on the same topic. So you managed to sign an agreement by the deadline, which was March 31st. And when Minister Lafrenière was asked at the time, he said, well, with the federal side, it was easier because we actually cohabit on the land with the Innu population. What do you think of that? Well, I would answer first that people could perhaps check where I indeed live. I would say cohabitation is a bit of an excuse. I have a fiduciary duty to serve Indigenous peoples. It is my responsibility. And as a citizen, a private individual, I need to teach my children about this. And that duty I have is not federal or provincial, it's a moral duty. So I think that that kind of comment can come easily. And I think that the majority of the capital in Canada comes from the federal level. We had to have very difficult discussions about taxation internally, and we managed to get through it. So it does become an issue of political will, ultimately.
In these issues, the federal government moves generally slower than provincial governments when they really want to move. So if that is my understanding from having worked with many of them, regardless of political stripes, there is a capacity to be more nimble at the provincial level when reconciling on a number of issues that sometimes touch with natural resources and touch with other matters that have been raised today. When it comes to Quebec, this is because there is no institutional memory, there is no muscle memory that exists, for example, in some of the processes that we have in BC. It is very personal, and it really takes the involvement of the Prime Minister, given the structure of Indigenous affairs, despite the good faith and the good relationship that we have with Yann Lafrenière, the Indigenous Minister in question. The institutional capacity and ability to move the system lies with the Prime Minister. When talking about who is closer to Indigenous peoples, I think this is a moral obligation of all people that look like me. and it is one that does not have to do with the role that I occupy, despite the fact that the role I occupy impels me to serve Indigenous people. So those arguments are always easy to make, but this is about political capital, political will, and the willingness to get it done and to kick your own system internally to get it done.
On passe maintenant à notre collègue en ligne.
We're now going to go online.
To the room. Veuillez utiliser la fonction lever à main si on a une question. Et on attend juste une minute pour les mains.
Oui, allô?
Oui.
Vous m'entendez?
Can you hear me? Yes. My name is Bernard. I work for the Atikamekw Montagnais Society. I have two questions that I'm sure are of concern for Quebec. The First Nations Quebec and Labrador Association or National Assembly contested legally at the Supreme Court on the fact that there is one common language, which is French in Quebec. 14 articles of the French language charter have been called into question. Is Quebec backtracking on this? I have no idea if this affects the treaty. Perhaps it does. This was announced on April 20th. The three bands who are with Minister Miller supported that request. That's my first question. I'm very sorry, Mr. Hervieux. Are you a reporter? Yes, I work for the Société de Communication Atikamekw. I am a journalist. I had another question before going on to answers. The general $760,000 had to be attributed to a specific community. This was announced on December 15th in favor of the community so that the Quebec and Canada governments would give $1.6 million to the community, refunding an underfunding of the police forces of this community. These are two of my questions. I think that's where the Quebec government is at a standstill since things have not been settled yet. Does anyone have any answers to these questions with regards to French in Quebec and the First Nations or police forces?
Alors, c'est clair que...
Of course, your questions are very relevant. However, I think that the Quebec government would be better placed to answer. With regards to their intentions, which are sometimes ill-advised, for example, when they develop legislation that has a direct impact on First Nations, well, we are in a difficult position. We can't say that it's for those reasons that Quebec is not at the table right now. What I can say is that with regards to the treaty, things will be a lot clearer with various governments, provincially or federally. We will have tools at our disposition to ensure that different levels of government respect the development of respect our First Nations when there is development of various legislation. So, of course, there could be various threats and impacts on First Nations, and this will help us better safeguard these things.
South Shushan.
Allô, OK. Je m'adresserai à vous trois.
The question is for the three chiefs. You talk about wanting to speak to your populations, but they don't seem to be informed or consulted with regards to your treaties or to the treaty. What are your thoughts? They don't even seem to be aware of this press conference happening today in Ottawa with Minister Miller. Well, after 40 years of work, of efforts and hope, indeed, that is a threat that we had shared with different stakeholders across Quebec and Canada. Our people have lost hope and trust that our rights will be recognized. We want to compensate our First Nations for past damages, but we also want leverage in order to ensure our development that are social and economic and take our responsibilities, be able to develop our own laws that are important to us and relevant to us. We do also share that perspective. We have deployed many efforts to keep the population aware on the evolution of the treaty. People are eager to have access to the text of the treaty in order for them to make their own opinions. This is what we are seeking to do over the coming months and weeks. Quebec, of course, would have to join us and honor its commitment to work hard and come up with an honorable treaty. But it is clear that with the information that we have, we will be simplifying certain things and sharing what we have agreed upon with Quebec and the federal government in order to present it all to our populations in line with the objectives and principles that have always guided us. The population sometimes have participated in different consultations with regards to the negotiations, and we will keep them up to date according to those principles. So that process will come about eventually, but I will admit that indeed there is a questioning of the negotiation process, and I do understand them. It's been 40 years. I think it's normal. Follow-up question. I would like to talk about the communication to our populations. At Esipit, we have tools. We have a Facebook group, and Petapan also shares a lot of information on the Facebook group. We have public assemblies quite often, and we talk about the negotiations. Our members at Esipit are aware of the negotiations. The information is shared with them frequently and regularly. The current challenge is the following. We need to reach new members. There are people who have just arrived. When the federal government removed a certain article, there was a disbursement, and there are some people who need to be educated because they're starting from scratch, but others, well, we've done, unless we have dinner together, then I think that we are doing a very good job at disseminating the information. Well, what if you do a vox pop where we go to a gas station and you can talk to people to see if they are in agreement with the treaty or not? What do you think of that? Well, I don't think now we would be able to do that because the last 2 years have been very productive and a lot has changed. I want to thank the negotiation between Petapan and the federal government. And now we have to go back to the population and tell them about what's been happening, and the referendum will be their choice. We're talking about a 3-year period, if, of course, things go well with Quebec. We have another question. Oh, apologies. In Natashquan, the announcement that the Innu language is the first language is very important. We have to translate the treaty.
Innu-Yamon, comparé avec Isipit.
The mother tongue in Natashquan is Innu, and it's very important to let our members know that.
Oui, l'équipe est en train d'être.
The team is in place with regards to communications.
Les APTN National.
On a une autre question sur.
We have one more question on Zoom. Camille Lacroix from Radio-Canada. Can you hear me? Yes. Camille Lacroix for Radio-Canada. You talked about the deadline with regards to the consultations. Can you specify for the referendum? Will that happen this week, next week? And maybe a sub-question, is there another deadline for Quebec? I can try to answer. No, we don't have a deadline right now for Quebec. Not right now. What we want right now is a constructive dialogue with the Premier in order for us to agree on our direction. That is our goal. With regards to the process, for us, we have an agreement between negotiators, so between the federal government and our First Nations. That's the first step. But of course, our negotiators have to agree with Quebec in order to have a treaty. Once we have that treaty politically, after informing our populations, which will probably last a few weeks or months, we will then, after these discussions with our populations, authorize negotiators to ratify this treaty. And then we would move on to a referendum. So we're thinking to 18 to 24 to 36 months before a referendum. During that period, of course, that allows different governments to honor their commitments with regards to third parties or other First Nations who might have some interests with regards to the land that in territory that is spoken about in this treaty. So in the next weeks or month, we're not going to be signing a treaty. We are now informing our populations. We are having discussions with them and presenting what is available, and we will make sure that our First Nations are at ease with what we will be proposing as a referendum, and then make sure it is adopted. So would you like to have a follow-up question? No, thank you. Any questions? We have time for one more question and a follow-up question. So since the beginning, when we've talked about Petapan and relationships with Quebec, you say that you have good relationships with Minister Lafrenière. You say that it's been going well and that there are good intentions. But lately, you've been talking about silence, and it's at the end, and you're waiting for the end of the process to sign an agreement. Where is the standstill? Is it with ministers? That's what we've understood. We did mobilize in order to meet MNAs and ministers to allow them to understand our issues and to get this treaty signed. But of course, there are some political stakeholders that we have not met up with yet who might have more specific questions and might require different answers in order to reassure them. Right now, I think that they had plenty of time to make offers and go about the negotiations in order to conclude this treaty, which will include Quebec. So as Mr. Miller was saying, at this point, these are more personal issues. It would be ministers or people who are responsible for certain regions who have an issue with what's in the agreement. Well, that is a hypothesis of ours. We might have to address it with the Quebec government in order to understand why Quebec needs more time to digest this treaty, because we are at the end of the process. We don't think that there is a major issue on the economic deal and on the financing question, which are very well structured. So that everything has been, all the negotiations have been done properly. So we just hope that the message will be sent to the government of Quebec, specifically to Mr. Legault, for what is to come. That is all the time that we have today. Thank you very much to our guests.